Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of England Leeds branch and on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And I'm pleased once again to welcome international viewers from across the globe. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Dr. Nir Arielli, and I'll introduce Nir in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. We will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility. This allows you to send a message to the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded. It will be available on our website at milim.org.uk in the coming days. There you will find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Nir Arielli is Associate Professor of International History at the University of Leeds. His most recent book, From Byron to Bin Laden, A History of Foreign War Volunteers, was published in 2018. He's also the author of Fascist Italy and the Middle East, 1933 to 1940, as well as co-writing and editing other works and publishing numerous articles. His current work examines the human history of the Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea, which he's going to speak about this evening. Nir, we are all fascinated and interested to hear what you've got to say. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that introduction. Let me try to share my screen and we will begin. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the many faces of the Dead Sea, but before that, if you will indulge me, I will say a little bit about myself, just to add to what has already been said. So until not so long ago, I used to work on a different topic, the history of foreign war volunteers. And in fact, I had the honor of presenting some of my work to a Jewish Historical Society gathering in Leeds in 2016 BC, before COVID. And in 2018, I published my first book, my book on the topic, From Byron to Bin Laden. Why am I not able to? Oh, here we are. So that's From Byron to Bin Laden. And once the book was out of the way, I began to think about what my next big project should be. Now, I'm a father to young children, and protecting the environment has always been something I care about, but raising young children has increased my concern about the state of the world we're leaving behind for the next generation. So I decided to focus on the history of a place I know well, a place that is suffering from a major man-made environmental crisis, and that's the Dead Sea. And as you can see from these NASA satellite images, the Dead Sea is shrinking, and it's shrinking at a very fast rate. But before we talk about the lake's modern history and the causes for its environmental degradation, I want to take you further back in time. And the Dead Sea has a long, illustrious human history that goes back about 10,000 years. But 10,000 years is a lot for historians. In geological terms, it's a very young lake. It was formed as a result of tectonic plate movement. Geologists debate whether the rift that we now know as the Jordan Valley was formed by the Arabian plate in the east sliding north past the Sinai plate in the west, or whether the two plates are simply moving away from each other. Be the cause as it may, the rift has seen a number of what bodies of water that have filled it over time. So to begin with, it was a lagoon. It was connected to the Mediterranean Sea. Then we had Lake Amora, then we had Lake Samra. Lake Lisan, the final body of water, is the one we know most about. It was there in around 70,000 years ago and 15,000 years ago. And we know about it, we know quite a bit about it because of the sediments that it has left behind. I'm interested in history, so the French geologist Louis Laden, who toured Ottoman Palestine and Transjordan in 1864, was the first to refer to the salt and gypsum-rich sediments he encountered to the south and north of the Dead Sea as the Lisan Formation. Don't know how well you can see the map on the right, but Latte, around the Dead Sea, especially in the north, you can see in sort of a shade of green these sediments that he found, which he called the Lisan Formation. He called them the Lisan Formation after the Lisan Peninsula. That's a peninsula that back in the 19th century still protruded into the Dead Sea. It doesn't anymore because of the drying up of the Dead Sea. In any case, he suggested that this telltale formation is the remainder of a much larger body of water that preceded the modern day Dead Sea. Now, Lake Lisan receded and all but disappeared at the end of the last ice age. Before then, there was no room for human communities to establish themselves in the Dead Sea Basin. And they could only begin to establish settlements after the Lisan Lake disappeared. At first glance, the Dead Sea that filled the deepest area in the basin and the area around the Dead Sea do not seem like pleasant places to reside. Many a visitor, both past and present, have found the lake and the surrounding barren desert landscape uninviting. Let me give you a few quotes to illustrate. The 2nd century Greek geographer Pausanias, who coined the name the Dead Sea that lives on in English and French, German, Italian, and other European languages, noted that, and I quote, "The lake is barren of fish. Their danger stares them in the face and they flee back to the water, which is their native element." So that is to say, back into the Jordan River. Several centuries later, the Yale geography professor Ellsworth Huntington, who toured the area in 1909, declared that, and I quote, "The future holds nothing in store for the sea better than the past." To this, he added, "The hot, unhealthy coasts may in times be visited for their scenery or for their association, but the sea is dead, and out of it no life can come." More recently, the eminent German biblical scholar Wolfgang Zwickel delivered a similarly scathing appraisal. "The Dead Sea is an unpleasant waste and extremely hot area, a region where nearly nobody wants to live." Last, but by no means least, when I asked my 5-year-old daughter, Adri, what she thought of the Dead Sea, she immediately replied, "I hate it. It's terrible." Clearly, she had not forgotten the stinging sensation on her skin from her brief dip in the lake nearly 2 years earlier. But the one thing I want to emphasize in this talk is that the history of the Dead Sea is full of contradictions. So while it may seem desolate, it also provided havens where very early settlements flourished. Let's start with Jericho. So I need to say a thing or two about the name. We have no idea what this settlement was called back in the Neolithic age. From about 1800, we estimate that it was called Rucha. That's the Canaanite name. But before then, we just call the settlements by the names they were recognized in the 19th century. So this is Tel el Sultan, next to Jericho. The spring of Ain Sultan is located a few kilometers northwest of the Dead Sea, next to the modern day town of Jericho on the West Bank. And the spring feeds one of the largest oases in the whole Levant area. After an extremely arid phase that lasted about, well, almost a full millennium, and marked the end of the Lisan Lake, by around 9600 BCE, wetter conditions returned at the start of the Holocene. Annual floods deposited rich, fertile soil where the wadis opened up into the Jordan Valley, and the spring of Ain al-Sultan flowed with new vigor, watering the oasis all year round. By 9600 BCE, an exceptionally large village of mud brick houses developed in Jericho. It housed over 500 people, perhaps for the first time in human history, and it later increased in size to at least 2,000 inhabitants by 7,500 BCE. Kathleen Kenyon, the British archaeologist who excavated Jericho in the 1950s, made an extraordinary discovery. She found a wall 3.6 meters high and 1.8 meters wide. Inside the wall, she found the remains of a tower 8 meters high and 9 meters in diameter. Kenyon assumed the wall must have been used to defend the settlement. A wall like, I don't know, she compared it to a medieval wall, and she said she was quite impressed with a tower which would have fitted in a medieval castle. However, there are no remains of weaponry for warfare in this early period. Moreover, the wall didn't surround the whole settlement. As Ofer Bar Yosef later showed in the 1980s, the wall is better understood as a defense not from enemy attack, but from floodwater. Aside from a wall and a tower, pre-pottery Neolithic Jericho boasted impressive experimentation with agriculture. They used canals to cultivate barley and emmer wheat, and archaeologists have also uncovered remains of domesticated dogs, sheep, goats, and surprisingly, bees. Obsidian was also found, bearing witness to systems of exchange and transmission reaching as far as Anatolia, where the material was sourced. Jericho saw phases of rise and fall over the following millennia. It probably reached its zenith in the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE. At this stage, we could probably more accurately refer to it as a city, although there's some debate of whether it's really the oldest city in the world. So if one contrast of the Dead Sea area is between its supposedly inhospitable environment and the settlements that flourished around it from a very early stage, another is between its diverging perceptions from a religious perspective. On the one hand, the Dead Sea area has long been associated with sin and vice. For many centuries, it was believed to be the site of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed by fire and brimstone because of the sins of their residents. The destruction of Sodom became a popular theme among Baroque artists as the examples, as the images in this slide illustrate. Countless pilgrims and explorers visiting the Dead Sea sought the remains of Sodom and Gomorrah, with some suggesting that after their destruction, these biblical cities were submerged by the lake itself. The smell of sulfur, which is quite potent in some places near the lake, has often been associated with the devil. However, sites around the Dead Sea have also been associated with purity in both Jewish and Christian traditions. I'm sure you're all aware, you've all heard of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. The first set of scrolls were discovered by chance in 1947, with archaeologists and antique smugglers racing to find more fragments ever since. The scrolls were most likely written, or at least held, at the Second Temple era site of Qumran. The scrolls were subsequently hidden in nearby caves, probably in 68 CE, during the Jewish revolt against the Romans. So you can see in the image on the left some of the caves where the scrolls were found. Many of the scrolls feature the oldest copies available of various books of the Bible. Some of the scrolls pertain to customs of the community that lived at Qumran. According to a recent study by Daniel Weinstub, Qumran was the center of an annual pilgrimage where people from all over Roman Palestine, people who belonged to the community he calls the Yahad sect, the Together sect, would come together to take part in a covenant renewal ceremony. Today, you can see some of the most impressive scrolls in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, in the National Museum of Jordan in Amman, and in various other libraries and museums around the world. For many Christians, there is a holy site just north of the Dead Sea at Qasr el-Yahud. Qasr el-Yahud is the traditional site of the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist near the Jordan River. And it's been associated, the site has been associated with the baptism of Jesus ever since the Byzantine period. The image on the left shows one of the churches that was constructed in the 1920s and 30s. So in the 1920s and 30s, during the British Mandate period, the Catholic Church and various other Christian denominations bought plots of land in the vicinity and built a number of churches and monasteries on the western bank of the river. Now, hopefully you can make out there's a sign warning people of mines next to the fence of this church. Because these sites were abruptly abandoned following the 1967 Six-Day War and the Israeli conquest of the West Bank. After the conflict, the Israeli military laid mines around the churches and monasteries to prevent infiltrations by Palestinian organizations from the eastern side of the Jordan, so the period of the Fedayeen. Consequently, these Christian sites of worship remained inaccessible for several decades. Only very recently, over the last few years, the charity organization Halo ran a mine clearing project at Qasr el-Yahud, And today, I think they've finished. So, should you wish to visit, I believe the site is now safe to do so. But please check before traveling, and don't just take my word for it. Okay, let's go back to the past. When political conditions were right, the Dead Sea area was the site of considerable wealth and splendor. In the 1st century BCE, King Herod went on a building spree. He built not only the palace fortress of Masada on the left, but also a magnificent palace at Jericho and other splendid constructions on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. But the Dead Sea was also the site of war. As you know, Masada was destroyed after a long siege at the end of the Jewish revolt against the Romans. And as a matter of fact, during a later revolt against the Romans, the revolt of Bar Kokhba, in the 2nd century CE, the village of Ein Gedi next to the Dead Sea was abandoned. Some of its residents fled and found refuge in the nearby caves, where in the 1960s, archaeologist Igal Yadin found their letters and some of their precious belongings. This is the famous Cave of Secrets. Under the Byzantine Empire, the Dead Sea area flourished once more. Several forts as well as Christian monasteries were constructed all around the lake. En Gedi was revived and was described by one contemporary historian as a very large village of Jews. As the 6th century mosaic that was discovered at Madaba illustrates, the Dead Sea was part of a trade route. Hopefully you can make out the image. If not, I will reprimand the photographer, which is me. But it shows Jerusalem is the major urban center at the center, but just above it is the Dead Sea. And on the Dead Sea, we can just about make out a boat loaded with goods sailing across the Dead Sea. It gives us an idea of the trade taking place during this time. And during the Byzantine era, at least in the history of Palestine, this is probably the era which it was most populated until the late 19th century. Right. After the Byzantine period, the Dead Sea region entered an era of decline, which was caused by a combination of factors. I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A, should you wish me to do so. It only became a site of intensive activity once again in the late 19th century. The Ottomans constructed roads and built a bridge across the Jordan north of the Dead Sea. And the Ottoman government also granted a concession to create salt pans north of the Dead Sea to increase salt production. It also put a modest fleet of sailboats into operation on the Dead Sea. So if you like, the Dead Sea was beginning to revive. European explorers, such as those sent by the British Palestine Exploration Fund, promoted the scientific study of the area. They measured the height of the Dead Sea's water level and ascertained that it was in fact nearly 400 meters lower than the level of the Mediterranean Sea. The disparity in height led many, including the founding father of the Zionist movements, Theodor Herzl, to envisage bringing water from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea in order to generate hydroelectricity. In the image on the left, you can see the plan from the late 19th century that inspired Herzl to build a canal from the Mediterranean, to bring it down to the Dead Sea, and to generate electricity from that. By the 20th century, the Dead Sea entered a period of rapid change. After the British conquest of Palestine, the engineer and entrepreneur Moshe Novomieski was given a concession to extract potash from the Dead Sea with a method he had developed using evaporation pans. This method is still used today, and in fact, the ICL, the Israeli company that extracts potash, bromine, sodium chloride, and magnesium from the Dead Sea, controls a significant share of the global market. And this brings me to the final contrast. While the Dead Sea supports a massive mineral extraction industry, it is at the same time constantly shrinking. How did this come about? Well, it comes about because the water that used to flow into the Dead Sea is now siphoned and diverted elsewhere. It's diverted first by Israel. Israel built its national water carrier in the 1960s. This was a massive infrastructural operation that brought water from the Sea of Galilee all the way to the western Negev, where it was used to irrigate land that had previously not been used for agriculture. So that was one cause. And for that reason, the Sea of Galilee, the dam at the southern edge of the Sea of Galilee was closed and effectively using it just as a water storage lake, no longer feeding the Dead Sea or releasing only a minute amount of water to the Dead Sea. And then on the eastern side, the Jordanians built the East Ul Canal. The East Ul Canal connects to the Yarmouk River, which is a tributary of the lower Jordan River, and siphon off some of the water from the Yarmouk and lead it down the Jordan Valley. And it was initially irrigated about half the Jordan Valley, and then over the years they extended it, and it leads almost all the way to the Dead Sea and enables the Jordanians to irrigate fields along the Jordan Valley. As a result of all of this, the amount of water that flows down the Jordan River has been reduced by around 90%. So the image on the left shows the lower Jordan Valley next to the the lower Jordan River next to the Sea of Galilee in the 1930s, next to Kibbutz Beit Zera. And the image on the right, I took myself this winter. I couldn't find the exact spot where the settler was standing, but it gives you a sense of how narrow the river is compared to how it was in the past. Not only is it narrow, but also the quality of water is a lot poorer, and it's full of pollutants and already quite salty even before reaching the Dead Sea. As a result of all that, the level of the Dead Sea is dropping at a very, very fast rate. So it's losing about, actually more than a meter per year. So if it hovered around 395, that is to say minus 395 meters below the Mediterranean sea level in the 1970s, today, or last time I checked, it was minus 433 meters below sea level. Moreover, as a result of the dropping water level, this created the sinkholes that you can see in this image. And these sinkholes, some of them look spectacular, but they've also caused very significant damage to the tourism industry along the coast of the Dead Sea. including for kibbutz and Gedi, that has lost some of the land it used to use for agriculture and for tourism as well. Last point before I finish is that, is there a solution? Well, one solution that was proposed and has been debated over the last 15 years is the so-called Red Dead Canal. The idea to construct a canal, it's not really a canal, it's a water carrier that will bring water from the Red Sea near Aqaba on the Jordanian side. The water will be desalinated, and then the people of Amman would be able to use it, and the leftovers will flow into the Dead Sea. I think appetite for this solution has dropped significantly. The World Bank, which was supposed to finance it or finance parts of it, has also is beginning to lose interest. So the Red Dead Canal at the moment seems unlikely. The alternative solution that environmental NGOs are promoting, and which I'm quite keen on, is the idea, resembles a little bit the idea that Herzl was flirting with at the turn of the 20th century. So we are now able to bring water from the Mediterranean to the Sea of Galilee, desalinated water, because Israel has made strides in desalination technology. So to bring water to the Sea of Galilee, then the level of the Sea of Galilee could be maintained. As you can see from the two images, it too fluctuates quite significantly depending on the amount of rainfall. And then once sufficient water is available, some of it, of course, will have to go to Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, where water scarcity is very, very severe. But some of it ideally could flow down the Jordan River and revive the river, which, as I showed you, is suffering from severe environmental degradation itself. And some of it would reach the Dead Sea and help to raise its level, or at least stop its decline as far as possible. So I'm now in the business of writing a book about the human history of the Dead Sea. As you probably know, academic publications move at a glacial pace, so it'll be another 2 years before the book is out. But the idea that I'm trying to promote is the one I've just told you about, the one that environmental organizations such as EcoPeace are trying to promote, of bringing water to the Sea of Galilee, reviving the Jordan Valley, providing drinking water to the Kingdom of Jordan, and allowing some water to flow down to the Dead Sea. That is all I have prepared, so I'll stop sharing now, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you, Nir. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation, really interesting. I'm sure all of our audience are familiar with the Dead Sea, but I would imagine few are familiar with many of the things you just told us. So thank you for that. If you have questions for Nir, please type them into the Q&A now, and we will endeavour to answer those in the time we have left. You mentioned earlier that it was considered unusual to find remains of bees in an archaeological context. Why would that be? Because bees presumably were always around.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. It's not the bees themselves. It's the fact that archaeologists could say with a degree of confidence that these bees were domesticated. So that they had already in the Neolithic period learned how to domesticate bees and could produce honey at significant quantities and sort of at diverging sort of diverging quantities and qualities. So they were confident about domestication, which is I'm not an archaeologist. I just thought that was pretty neat thing that they could say from their findings.
Okay, we have a question from Linda Rosen. Linda says, can tourism be sustainable in the Dead Sea area?
That's an excellent question, Linda. So it's being sustained artificially on the Israeli side. Practically all the hotels on the Israeli side of the Dead Sea are on the southern basin of the lake. Now, the southern basin, if it was up to nature, would have been dry by now because there's not enough water in the Dead Sea. But what the Israelis have done is to build a canal that pumps water from the northern basin, which is larger and deeper, brings it to the southern basin, and created gigantic artificial pools. Now, the pools are there to serve the factories of ICL, the company that extracts the minerals. They want the salt to sink, and then they can harvest it. But one of the very big pools is the pool serving the hotels on the Israeli side. So, in fact, they're swimming in a pool with Dead Sea water. On the Jordanian side, this is much more precarious. So they built their hotels in the northeastern side of the lake. They're between the few of us. They're much more aesthetically pleasing than the Israeli hotels. They really look amazing. The problem is, every year they get further and further away from the lake itself. So I'm not, they have to keep moving the infrastructure. They do it in the West Bank part of the Dead Sea as well, not so far from Jericho. So the resort is built high up, and the actual beach is lower and lower each year. I think here the tourist industry will join hands with the extraction companies. They all want more water reaching the Dead Sea in order for at least the level to stop dropping. And I think this must happen if we want to sustain a tourist industry there.
Okay, thank you. Now, Suzanne Korn asks, does the Dead Sea support any kind of wildlife? And if so, how has this been affected?
Excellent. Right. So there's a lot of wildlife around the Dead Sea. There's quite amazing wildlife. So it's on the path of migrating birds. So there's amazing birds that fly there. There are the ibex, Yael in Hebrew, which are kind of the symbol of the wildlife of the area. There are types of wolves and hyena. There were tigers, or leopards rather, until the 1970s. There are no fish in the Dead Sea. So any fish that's unfortunate enough to end up in the Dead Sea will die within minutes and wash up on shore. There are not many of them making it into the Dead Sea nowadays, but we have excellent accounts from the 19th century of exactly that. So fish sort of finding themselves in the Dead Sea and washing up to the shore within minutes.
Malcolm Addlestone asks, without action, will the Dead Sea disappear in the next few hundred years or less?
Great question, Malcolm. Probably not entirely. So what scientists think, and I have to take their word for it because I'm not a scientist myself, is that basically, okay, so the northern basin of the Dead Sea is quite deep. So it will continue to recede until a point where it's small enough, where the little amount of water that comes in is enough to sustain it, and the evaporation, as the size of the lake reduces, the evaporation decreases. So at a certain point in time in the future, the lake, by then it'll be a briny pond, will be small enough to maintain an equilibrium, but it will be tiny, it will be briny, and it's not. I don't think it's somewhere we want to be.
Can you explain the effects of the mud helping psoriasis, lupus, and rheumatoid arthritis?
Right. Okay. Again, I to take whatever I say here with a large grain of Dead Sea salt, because I'm not a physician. So the mud has been associated with medicinal properties for quite some time. I'm trying to track down the origin, historical origin. I've not done so yet, but suffice it to say, there's a long tradition that believes the mud is good. What is really beneficial for people suffering from psoriasis is actually the sunlight or the sunshine. Now, as I said, the Dead Sea is at minus 400 meters below sea level. So it gets sunlight, which is good for the skin. It gets far less UV radiation. So the UV radiation exposure by the Dead Sea is far reduced from what it is at sea level, and certainly higher up in a mountain. So for that reason, it is recommended for psoriasis reasons to come and get exposed to the sun with all the positive effects that it has and the vitamin D, etc., next to the Dead Sea. So there's the combination of the mud and the sunshine, and there are also hot springs on both sides of the Dead Sea, so near En-Gedi in the west, and near the ancient city of Cagliari or Zara in the east, and those are associated with health and well-being as well, and they have been since 2000 years ago. We know that King Herod, when he was dying, he came down to the Dead Sea um, in the hope that this would revive him, a hope that was dashed, and he died in Jericho.
Tanya Nelson asks, in what way will the Dead Sea cosmetic industry be affected? I'm assuming by the decline in the water level.
Well, the Dead Sea cosmetic industry, Ahava, for instance, the big company, Israeli company, they should be able to continue to extract the mud and the minerals they need for the merchandise that they produce. So for the time being, they're not that threatened. If the lake continues to recede and the mud dries up, that's a different question. But for the time being, they at least are safe.
So your preferred solution is to pump water into the Kinneret, desalinate this water.
Desalinate first, then in the Kinneret.
Yeah. But isn't this a long way round? I mean, why would we not just pump seawater straight into the Dead Sea? Could we not do that?
Well, two reasons. First of all, and here I think the environmental organizations and ICL, the company that's extracting minerals, I think this is the only thing they agree on, that seawater, if you bring seawater into the Dead Sea, it will create another type of water, which we don't want. Also, I mean, there's a question, I mean, pumping water, building canals or building sort of the whole infrastructure that will lead seawater to the Dead Sea is quite expensive. So I think the optimal solution from the perspective of environmentalists is, if we have to desalinate water, which we probably do in a situation of global warming, we can use it for multi-purposes. So we can use it to maintain the level of the Sea of Galilee, of Kinneret. We can use it to provide drinking water for the Jordanians. We can use it for the whole Jordan Valley to irrigate it, and we can use some of it to sustain the level of the Dead Sea. So we are getting not a double dip, like a triple or a quadruple dip, if we manage to do it. It's not problem-free. So the process of desalination it takes a lot of energy, and there's some pollution associated with that as well. But I think, by and large, the benefits could outweigh the problems.
Well, let's hope this happens soon, and the decline of the Dead Sea is stopped. Nir, that's been an absolutely fascinating talk, and thank you for answering our audience's questions. Nir's books are available on Amazon, but as yet they're not. There's nothing published about the Dead Sea, but hopefully there will be soon. To say thank you to you, I'm going to send you some of my photographs. This is Magen David Adom in action in Israel, saving lives. So hopefully you'll enjoy that, and it might give you something to think about in terms of what Israelis are doing, coexisting and saving lives in ambulances. Now, just a few words about our upcoming programme before we leave you. Next week, the 11th of July, we have Simon Parkin with us. He's speaking about the British wartime internment of Jewish refugees suspected of being Nazi spies. The following week, we have the Mancunian Bernard Lester. He is looking a humorous look at 50 glorious years as a dentist. Then on the 25th of July, we welcome Richard Zimler back for his 4th visit to Milim, and this is the launch of his latest novel, The Incandescent Threads, which is a thrilling and fantastic read, just like all of his other books. We have more amazing speakers coming up, so please do visit our website at milim.org.uk to book your tickets and to sign up to our newsletter to make sure you don't miss anything. All of our events are free, but you can make a small donation if you wish. There is a link in the chat to do that, or of course visit our website. So it remains for me to thank our guest, Nir Arielli, once again. Thank you so much, Nir.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And looking forward to seeing you all again at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.